So I just finished recording an interesting chat with my friend Joe about the Boston Tea Party and the founding of America. And I realized as soon as I was done that I am a complete idiot. In fact, I've known that for a long time. But in this particular case, I was an idiot in a very specific way. Throughout the conversation I was having with him, I used the term seeding when I meant the term planting, to refer to the sending out of people to foreign lands to essentially colonize those lands. And I talked about how it started from Britain to Ireland, going back to the Middle Ages. And I said that the British seeded Ireland. It wasn't called that, it was called planting Ireland. So please forgive me. I've got no excuse. As I said, just an idiot. And you know how it is when you get into a rut and you just keep doing the same wrong thing over again? Well, that's what I did. Anyway, rather than trash the whole conversation, which was my first suggestion to Joe by text once we were done, he said, no, it's a nice authenticity, some nice energy in it. So instead, I'm recording this correction and apology. So whenever you hear the word seeding in what follows, think planting. All right, thanks a lot.
Hey everyone, Joe Stoffer here with Robin Koerner. Robin is a philosophy genius in my mind. He also, works with the John Locke Institute and is their director and helps academic dean.
Yeah.
And he helps kids, learn about freedom and all kinds of impressive things. Robin has a finesse for the left and the right and bridging the gap. And I love that about him because my entire life has been looking at the left and the right and being like, how do we align in the middle? And so I've never met anyone quite like Robin in terms of being able to have those conversations. And previously I had asked Robin about the Boston Tea Party. And, if he believed that the Boston Tea Party was ultimately because of the colonists being taxed too much by the king, which growing up in America was what we learned was the reason for the Boston Tea Party. Robin happens to be from England, so he's now an American. And I thought this would just be a stellar conversation because I recently asked people if they knew why we had the Boston Tea Party. Now, I don't claim to be the best American Revolution history buff by any means. And Robin isn't necessarily a historian by any means. But Robin, why was the Boston Tea Party not about taxes?
No, why was it not about taxes? Okay, well, it was kind of a bit about taxes. Well, or maybe I should even say it was about taxes and other things, but not necessarily in the way that the commonly held American founding myth suggests. Should we say that what I've encountered as a non-American, right? I mean, I'm an American now, but I wasn't educated in America as an American, so I didn't get the whatever that version is that all the school kids get here. And unlike most versions of histories that kids get, that everybody absorbs across the world, they're simplified, they're reworked, they serve a certain kind of crude agenda, and often obscure, I think, some of the most interesting and important facts and lessons, right, that can actually be drawn from, that might be drawn from a fuller telling, maybe, of the stories that are deemed to be important to a society's foundation or a country's foundation. So, yeah, and it's interesting to me because, of course, I'm kind of emotionally invested on both sides, right? It's like I'm an American patriot, but I'm also a Brit. And those two things, of course, are not exclusive. Although, if you believe the crude version of the American founding myth, you might think they are exclusive. Okay, so I think what needs to be said, and I'm not a historian, right? So this is just really me speaking, in some ways, maybe impressionistically, based on my bringing the ideas that I'm really interested in. And you mentioned my passion for freedom. I'm kind of a philosopher by intellectual disposition, as opposed to a historian. So I bring all that to the little bits of the story that I've encountered, I've come across. And in a way, that's all you can ever do if you're not a professional historian. You find things and you absorb things and you get bits of the story. There's an infinity of relevant facts, so you can only have a few. But anyway, so with all of that qualification,
so
go on.
Just real quick, I mean, that's awesome. And like my understanding has just basically been that the corporation got really big, and it was a very powerful corporation, the British East India Company, and they basically used the powers of the king or the queen to control more by kind of like utilizing government. So I look at it kind of like our modern day corporations that are abusing governmental powers, just like they did back then. And
okay, so no, that's an interesting way in, because I appreciate part of that premise, which is that a lot of what ails us is large corporations doing things that they can only do because they're given privileges by the state, by the government, that the rest of us cannot do. And in fact, I've written quite a lot about that in articles, and in particular in a chapter of my book. I wasn't here to discuss my book, but in a chapter of my book, I particularly go at exactly this phenomenon as it plays out in America with respect to the government and the privileges of the financial sector, large financial corporations, banks, et cetera, et cetera. So what you've just described as a fundamental problem is correct, right? We are suffering that today more than most people realize. We could have a whole conversation about that. If we haven't already, we probably have, Joe.
Vanguard, BlackRock.
And although it worked differently back in the 1700s, yeah, of course you had the same phenomenon. And in a way to unpack how it worked back then, I guess what you really are doing is finding out or discussing a little bit about how the British Empire kind of happened. And the astonishing thing about the British Empire is, and look, people would dispute this, and I'm going to say things that are controversial, as I say, in my perspective, but I think you can make a pretty damn good case that the British Empire was, to a first order approximation, an accident. And how the accident happened was adventurous Brits who wanted to make money started going around the world and setting up things that they needed to set up, settlements, later colonies as they came to be called, to do just that. And you can go back many hundreds of years to a phenomenon called seeding. It was the term, right? And seeding was when people from one country, it was a term used to describe English, Scots, Irish folks would, let's just say English and Scots and Welsh folks, because the first place we seeded, we being Britain, before it was actually Britain, the first place we seeded was Ireland. And seeding just meant sending folks out that wanted to set up over there, right? So the benefit to, there could be anywhere, right? Obviously, the east coast of what is now the United States was a big seeding adventure, and the rest is history, which is the history we're talking about. But so seeding served two purposes. It served a purpose for the folks going. They wanted a new life, all of that obvious stuff, better opportunities. Well, they weren't actually better opportunities, because usually when seeding happened, they were going to nothing. They were going to a place that at the time was essentially nowhere, but they were adventurous types and wanted to give it a go because they were fleeing whatever they were fleeing, poverty and so on in the home country. But also there was a potential political purpose for the powers that be. And when it all began, of course, those powers were kings and queens. They were the monarchy, really. Because if you can successfully seed another part of the world, you get to rule that part of the world, and your power and your prestige rise, right? So that that was a thing going on long before America started. And
the British East India Trading Company like goes back to like the 1600s, right?
yeah, I don't know the year, but that would be about right, because the thing I'm talking about, you can certainly identify going back further than that. In fact, if you actually talk about, if you consider Ireland, I mean, you're actually back in the Middle Ages, really. The first British colony was Ireland, right? Hence there's a little tension you might have heard about. Well, there has been for a while. Anyway, so you had that going on, and then in some of these instances, these brave folks actually did set up communities that functioned as trading posts, as means of moving goods and their to and fro, from the home country to this new land, wherever that was. And the Brits did that all over the place, and things grew. And so monarchs, in the first instance, would give charters to companies like the East India Company to go set up, essentially monopolize these commercial opportunities that manifest as settlements in these different parts of the world. All well and good, except that if you do that, if you are adventurous Brits, let's say, that set up on on the coast of India or the coast of the eastern seaboard or whatever it is, then you're likely to maybe piss off a few people, because at some point you're going to rub up against folks who are already there, who don't like the way you're operating, or who want a little bit of whatever it is you're getting, or whatever it might be, right? So then you have disputes. And then what happens, and we're getting to it, then what happens is, in the dispute, inevitably, an English or Scottish citizen will be hurt, will be unjustly treated. And so the settlers and the East India Company were responsible for a lot of the settlements, and their motivation was commercial, right? But that wasn't the only such company. They then write back to the motherland and say, we're being attacked, British citizens are being attacked, we need, we are tax-paying British citizens, right, even though they're around the world, come and defend us. And so what would happen was, and at the beginning of this piece of our history, of course, this all took a long time. It took a while for letters to get back to London from, wherever you might be around the world. And then it took quite a long time for the soldiers to come by ship, let's say, and land and support, protect the company employees, or these English citizens abroad, as they were. So that's what happened. So then what would happen is the government would send its people in, which is arguably acceptable, I suppose. That they have a duty to protect their citizens wherever they are in the world. And if you're powerful enough, you win some of those battles, and then you find you've got government people in places that aren't the country that they came from, right? And obviously certain things, certain kinds of political and legal and practical infrastructure have to be set up so that the people who were, the Brits who were originally attacked won't be again. The defense has to be made effective over the long term. So this mechanism has to be worked out, whereby, the East India Company types and the British government have some understanding. The government obviously sends its people out there. The East India Company and the likes of those companies are very happy with that, because that way they have the force of the British government to fall back on, right, as they continue in their commercial ventures. In other words, they're getting free protection from, a global superpower, under the cover of which they get to conduct business. Pretty good gig if you can get it, right? So that's what a lot of that was about. So you got into this situation over time where what was just, the king or the queen handing a charter to a few merchants with a few boats, becomes as I say, accidentally, the building of an empire, because you've got commercial operators protected by the force of the state, coming up all over the place. Well, that kind of is what an empire is eventually, because then of course you've got the ability and the temptation, which was not resisted, to tax the natives in the places where you are making your profit and have your soldiers helping you do so. And so what you get then is the extension of the state into the colonies, right? These things become colonies, and this becomes formalized, and so on and so forth. Anyway, I'm kind of broad brushing hundreds of years of growth of this phenomenon. And this was going on for many, many years before, the Queen of England, Victoria, got called the Empress. Before it was kind of a conscious, oh, we have an empire, and the empire is a worthy end of itself. Nobody set out to set up an empire. That's not how it started, but that's how, that's the situation we got to. Now, all of these Americans, or they weren't Americans, of course, they were Brits. They were Brits that came to what we now call America.
They were colonists.
They were colonists. And they had grievances regarding,
and this is basically the elite colonists that had the biggest grievances, right?
Well, let's put it this way. I guess in the sense that some elites tend to be more bothered about the exercise of power, both how it hurts them potentially and whether they can exercise power over others, right? They've got the means, the resource, the interest. So in as much as that's true, yes, I could agree with you, right? I guess what I'm saying is, people who are just trying to earn a living and get on with their lives and take care of their kids, they don't really have time for big politics. They're just trying to survive, right? That's truer. The farther back you go in history, the truer that becomes, right? Because the harder it was to survive and the more concentrated was political power. So that very much applies to the settlement of America, for sure. But of course, those colonists, being Brits, took with them political, cultural notions of the rights of Englishmen. The Englishman's home is his castle. The Englishman, has certain rights. Now, by the way, the taxation without representation, which we'll come back to, which is the big thing. You're asking about the Boston Tea Party, right? This issue of taxation. You can find that in Magna Carta, right? The idea of that is in Magna Carta, 1215. And whereas Magna Carta was not throughout the history of Britain as influential as we think it is now, a critical part of the answer to your question, Joe, is that it became extremely influential as an underpinning, as a justification for the grievances that the colonists had about their government back in London. And the reason that was because, again, broadly speaking, a guy called Edward Coke, spelt Coke, C-O-K-E, who was, as it were, the chief lawyer at the end of Elizabeth's reign and the beginning of James I's. And I even want to say maybe going into Charles I, right? So now we're talking about, where are we? Yes, the end of the 1600s, right? He wrote a lot. We still refer, lawyers, barristers, the legal profession still refers to his work as foundational. And he, as it were, revived Magna Carta in a reinterpreted fashion, which was as a foundational constitutional document of Britain, right? Well, it wasn't called Britain, but certainly of England. Yeah, the idea of Britain, by the way, came with James I in the 1600s, and it was formalized, the union with Scotland in just after 1700, right? Just at the beginning, very beginning of the 18th century, just to give you some time frames here. But this guy, Edward Coke, essential. He had this idea that Magna Carta was where Englishmen found their rights. And he basically made this document kind of sacred. And that was the idea. It was his Magna Carta that was in the minds of the colonists. And when the colonists started objecting to the meddling, as they saw it, of London in their lives in the colonies, because basically they just wanted to be left alone. They're going to set up their little governments for their little communities. Why should anybody give a damn across the Atlantic about how they're doing that? They know what their rights are. They're not dishonoring the monarch. They're not doing anything wrong. Let us get on with it. And that was kind of true to the political culture of England, and in particular, the justification of the rights of Englishmen that was being sacralized and celebrated at the time in this reworking, this reconceptualization of the English constitution, the unwritten constitution, right? The English have an unwritten constitution, but actually what Coke said was, yes, well, it's kind of unwritten, but actually we have our documents, right? It's not written in the formal sense, got the American Constitution on the wall, but we have founding documents, constitutional documents, and the Magna Carta is one. So the reason I'm telling you all of this is because the colonists repeatedly referred to their rights as Englishmen in their petitions to England throughout, well, right up to the founding, actually. And so they weren't saying we want anything special. They were just saying, we're English, treat us like we're English. Magna Carta, this guy Edward Coke, this is our constitution, basic rights of Englishmen, right? And now, the reason the tea was to be taxed was to do with the fact, and this also was quite, I think, a reasonable position, that the British government had spent loads of British money and quite a lot of blood defending the colonists from threats in America, right? There were the natives and various problems, right? And of course, when the colonists came, they didn't have the means to defend themselves. They didn't have the means to do everything they needed to stay alive. And that means was, in the normal fashion, supplied from London, right? And so from the London perspective, it was, we've spent all this money on these colonists. They ain't given us any love or appreciation, but we can at least make them pay for a bit of it. Because if we here in the motherland, in England, spend money for the benefit of the people, it has to be raised by taxation. Because what other way is there, right? So, we can't have these colonists being subsidized from the motherland. We've got to make it a little bit fair, at least, and that was where the idea of the tax came from. And when the law was passed to put the tax on the tea, under the auspices, I say, of the need to have the colonists pay for the defense, some of the defense that they were getting, some of the benefits they were getting from the British government. There was no, when that was proposed, it was passed without, it wasn't even a big deal. I mean, it's just obviously fair from the position of London, right? But from the position of the colonists, you had a situation where they had been petitioning for decades for various things, to be allowed to set up their government, to not be interfered with, by governors in a land that's thousands of miles away that didn't know anything about the lives of the colonists. And so they were ignored, and their appeals to Magna Carta, mostly, to other things as well, but especially to Magna Carta, were ignored. And so when they were taxed, this tax on tea, it was a question of straw that broke the camel's back, because it was a tiny tax, right? It wasn't like now we accept tax. Broadly speaking, as a nation, we accept tax. There's not riots in the streets, and we accept much, 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 much more tax than was being put on that tea. So it wasn't the tax per se. It was the fact that here is another violation, said these English colonists, of our basic rights as Englishmen. We are being taxed without being represented in Parliament, right? There was no seat in Westminster in the Houses of Parliament for, the colony of Massachusetts. That was the problem. And so it was not simply, we don't like tax, there's tax on this tea, new problem. No. This had been building for ages. And both positions, I think you can understand, actually, both sides of it.
And I guess the way that I've always, kind of looked at that was, which you kind of alluded to, right? Because it's like the monarch is protecting the British East India Company, right? And then now they want their money back from protecting them. So,
well, hold on, they were also actually protecting the colonists. It wasn't just cronyism. There was a lot of cronyism, and it wasn't just, that dark state corporate axis that we talked about at the top of this show. British tax money was spent on defending colonists from natives and other things, and no money was coming back, and the government just said, well, it's not fair. Simple.
So you don't really consider it a myth then that it's protected, but that it's about taxes?
Well, here's the bit.
I feel like if it was like taxes, they would have just gone and thrown some tea over, or they wouldn't have chosen, specifically to attack that company, right? Where they planned it for like 6 months before they actually had the Boston Tea Party.
Yeah, it had been a long time coming.
I feel like it was more strategic because who they went after and what they did specifically. But sure. I think I take your point. Yes, they were very well informed, right? They were better, let's put it this way, they were much better informed of their situation as colonists than were the government back in London, or indeed the British people at that time. So yeah, they knew, let's say, the mechanism of their subjugation, as they called it. The reason I use the word myth is not because, they say it's about tax, it wasn't about tax. Because it was, partially about tax, in as much as it was about taxation without representation, in as much as that is a violation of what was regarded a historic constitutional, right, British constitutional right. So you're saying it's more about rights than it is about tax? Oh yeah,
it's very much. It's more about these English people's, I know I keep saying English, but that is where it comes from. And it's kind of funny, there's that idea that Paul Revere said the British are coming, right? Right. He didn't, because he was talking to British people. They were all British. They didn't make any sense. He probably said the Redcoats are coming or something, right? But he wouldn't have said the British are coming any more than I would say to you, the Americans are coming. It doesn't make any sense, right? They were British. But here's the myth. Here's why I say myth. They thought of themselves not as other than Britain, but as profoundly Britain, right? What they wanted was not something other than was being offered to them by the English government or crown. What they wanted was to be allowed to be, as they saw it, fully English here in America, right? And so they felt that they were asking for no more than their birthright as Englishmen. They were not asking for something other than their birthright as Englishmen, right? So the problem was not that they wanted something that they could not have being British or in the let's say the liberal tradition from which they came, as it was then, but it was that they perceived the British government at that time of not behaving in a proper British way, according to the rights and customs that had been historically established, Magna Carta, Edward Cook, et cetera, for a long time, right? So now this is interesting because we talk about the American Revolution, and a revolution is not a 180-degree turn. That's half a revolution. A revolution is a 360-degree turn. And in this sense, the American Revolution actually was technically a revolution, because it was a bunch of English people wanting what they had the right to as English people, right? Not wanting to throw off something, not wanting the opposite of the thing. They just were demanding something they believed they already had. And so they felt that the government the government of England at the time, George III bogeyman, was simply not honoring his own people, right? So the reason I say myth, I'm getting there, I'm taking a long way, but a long way around. But the reason I say myth is fundamentally this. America thinks of itself as set up in opposition to the tyranny from which it came. That's a complete myth. America, as is obvious to everybody who comes, as is obvious to me as a Brit, right, is set up as a slightly better, more formal realization of the thing from which they came, from England, right? America is a what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of a flourishing of, or a version of, Englishness. They took with them, they've built a country, we've built a country as Americans mostly on what they took with them from England, not mostly on rejecting that. They accepted it hook, line, and sinker. The problem was, at the time of the founding, the British government itself wasn't. And we know that comes and goes in the history of a country. We can see that in our own history. Sometimes the government is more protective of the rights and customs of the people than it is of others. And I would also say that George III wasn't what I think he's caricatured as being. Here's one data point, and then I will take a breath and allow you to say whatever's in your head, Joe. George III never signed an executive order in his life. Our current president signs them on a weekly basis. George III had no dictatorial power, right? What happened to the colonists happened by virtue of votes of representatives in Parliament. Now, the problem was those representatives did not include representatives of the colonies. If only they did, the history would have been different, right? But, it wasn't that, I don't feel, it was that the English wanted to keep down the colonists. That clearly wasn't the case. there were two reasonable positions born out of very different perspectives. And, you know, they clashed and the rest is history, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess my biggest misunderstanding, at which that's interesting that, you know, you relate it to the rights of the people, of just wanting the basic rights that they always believed they had, right? And
Because they were English, not
right,
yeah,
right.
yeah, that's the important point. Yeah, yeah.
And I guess I just feel like it was more of a what's happening in our modern day world, which we touched on in the beginning, where now we have, you know, the Vanguard Group and BlackRock and State Street Corporation that basically just continue to be funded over and over and over again and become, you know, bigger than countries with the power that they control. So I was always like tying the power that the British East India Trading Company had and connecting it to our modern world. Although that's
okay. No,
it's probably not as true.
Don't give that up, Joe. Okay, nothing I was saying I think goes against what you've said, because I think what you said is fair. I mean, there is no doubt that if, let's put it this way, that the hand in glove nature of the relationship between the English government and the East India Company were, if today there was such a relationship that was as explicit as that relationship was back then, no one would tolerate it, right? I mean, you know, the kind of things you're talking about, the average person in the street doesn't see and think about very much. And probably if
they invest in their 401k and they have no idea how it feeds those corporations,
right, because that's not deemed moral, acceptable, the proper use of statecraft, of state force, etc., etc.
They just got better at hiding it.
Back then it was deemed acceptable, and it is exactly what happened. You know, maybe the difference between then and now, which I think goes to your point, is not that it was going on then and it isn't now. It's always been going on, including back then, but back then everybody kind of knew it and it wasn't such a big deal. Now we have to hide it because it would be a big deal if we didn't.
I mean, I love capitalism, right? Like my big thing is ethical, ecological, and empathetic capitalism. Like have these business practices, be in service, and, you know, the government's about checks and balances, not the force, right? And I've really appreciated this conversation. Like this has been awesome, because I just, you know, diving in and reading and researching and looking deeper, like it's always a good time, but at the same time, like so much more fun to just have a conversation about it.
Yeah, I've enjoyed this too. And before I forget, on the door of the Supreme Court, you can actually see the Magna Carta for the reasons, because of the story I've just told you. There's an image of it in one of the panels. And you can also see it on the seal of one of the states. It might be Massachusetts. You can actually see a guy holding Magna Carta on one of the state seals. Check which one. And by the way, I haven't seen if this is still the case, but an unbelievable number of state constitutions copied in explicitly Magna Carta. That's how much it was about rights understood in this way at that time.
Excellent. And like the whole time you were talking about it, you know, to me, it just reminded me of the Constitution, really, of like demanding the rights, right?
Yeah, I mean, and let's just be clear, there are bits of this that are copied out of, guess what? The English Bill of Rights, right? Like the English have a Bill of Rights. And the guys that wrote this Bill of Rights and that Constitution and that Declaration of Independence, you know, they were very, very familiar with it, right? So this is interesting. Magna Carta, foundational constitutional document, according to Cook, and this new understanding of British history and British political history and the history of rights of Englishmen. in that same paradigm, in that same understanding, that Magna Carta is one such foundational constitutional document. There are others, the English Bill of Rights being another one. So that's the 1680s, right? So you're looking at about 100 years before, roughly speaking, the foundation of the United States. But you also have in that paradigm as a foundation document the Petition of Right. And if you go through those documents, you can see how much of them appears in this. So my case that in some way, America is a flourishing, a version, a refinement of England rather than a rejection of it is right here in paper. Like, you don't have to take it from me. You can like literally just put the documents next to each other and read them. Yeah, it's interesting. So I kind of feel that the narrative of my life going from British born to American is parallel to the narrative of the history.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, thank you for, I mean, we've been talking for a minute now, even though I kind of want to start talking about like the French Bill of Rights and a few other things, right?
You probably know a lot more about any of that than I do. But we can, hey, I tell you what, let's just do it again, Joe. This has been a lot of fun. And it's good for me. It makes me think about things I might be beginning to forget. So it's good for me.
Good. Well, thank you for this. I appreciate it, Robin.
My pleasure.